So here we're going to look at the Parliament, and in particular we're going to look at how an individual can get into Parliament. So the first question that you need to ask is, well, which form of public office do we mean? The local, the state level, the federal level, whether or not it's an upper or a lower house, or whether or not we want to look at becoming the actual head of state. So starting with local councils, these are small areas given jurisdiction through what's known as delegated legislation over a small area, but most importantly, local councils are not constitutional bodies, they're statutory bodies. In other words, they exist only by virtue of the state legislation that creates them. In Queensland, the Queensland Lower House in Parliament has 89 members, and those 89 members represent individual electorates, like the country is divided up by population 89 times. Queensland Upper House, well, you can't run for that because that as a House of Review ceased in the year 1921. In the federal system, though, federal Parliament consists of an upper and a lower house, with the upper house being 76 senators elected via what's called proportional voting. Those senators ostensibly are there to represent the states and interests of the states. Each of the states has 12 senators, and there are 2 from each of the mainland territories. The lower house, or House of Representatives, is made up from people elected from 150 electorates across the country. The lower house is representative and of those people. The head of state in Australia is the Queen of Australia. You can't be the Queen, but you can become the Governor General or the State Governor for one of the states. However, the appointment of the Governor General or State Governors are done by the government of the day. It's not something that's commonly elected for. So, how do we go about actually voting? Well, in order to vote somebody, you have to either be an Australian citizen or have been a British citizen on the lecture roll before January 1984. You have to have an address. You can't be in prison for 3 or more years. You can't be convicted of treason. Finally, you have to be of sound mind, capable of understanding the process of voting and the consequences of voting itself. In order to run for Parliament, well, first you have to be able to vote. In other words, you have to be on the electoral roll. You must be an Australian citizen, but most importantly, to run for Parliament, you can only be an Australian citizen. Dual nationals cannot apply. You can't be convicted of an offence that and sentenced for over a year's worth of imprisonment. You can't be an undischarged bankrupt, and you can't work for any arm of the government. Finally, you can't have any form of monetary interest in government contracts, and that includes being a shareholder in small entities. It does not include being a shareholder in a large entity, such as a bank, which may deal with the government on a day-to-day basis. So, assuming that you're allowed to run and you're not disqualified, what you have to do, well, you've got to get enough votes. In our system, the House of Representatives at the federal level uses a preferential voting system whereby all of the candidates are numbered by the elector in order of preference. Well, the idea is that after the ballots are counted, if one person doesn't have an absolute majority, the person who's received the least number of votes is removed from the system, and then they're recounted in order of preference. This is contrasted with the Senate and the Australian Capital Territories, where they use still a preferential voting system, but it is proportional. So each seat in that particular, in the Senate, for example, is allocated a certain quota, and that a person, in order to get in, has to meet that quota. And again, that idea that the lowest candidate is removed, then everything's recalculated, and that process is continued until the seats are allocated. Other countries have proportional representation, such as New Zealand and Germany, where there's a combination of local and list MPs. The UK has a much more simple system called first past the post, whereby people are elected. Basically, the person who gets the most votes in a particular area becomes that MP. The US has a more complex system where it's essentially a winner takes all. Each of the states, when voting for a president, for example, is worth a certain number of college votes, so that as a result, the large swing states are ones where presidential candidates almost exclusively campaign in. And finally, Queensland uses a similar voting system to the House of Representatives in the federal Parliament, but it's optional. In other words, you don't need to vote the whole way through in order to complete your ballot. Okay, so great. We're in Parliament now. What does that mean? Well, it actually really depends on whether or not you're in the government or not. People can be elected to Parliament, but if they're in the opposition, they don't get to issue and create policy. Their job and role is exclusively to criticise and to try and scrutinise the actions of the government of the day. Hopefully, this very brief synopsis is helpful in understanding the role of the legislature.